When Japan blacklisted 110 Chinese tech firms last month, it expected applause from Washington. What it got instead was silence from Beijing. Days later, shipments of rare earth metals vanished from Chinese ports. Automakers in Nagoya scrambled for magnets. Chipmakers burned through inventory. And Tokyo's trade officials realized the sanctions had triggered something larger, a quiet economic siege. Japan had just sanctioned its own supply chain. Traders who had read the Meiji note also remembered that Japan's move did not land in a vacuum. Beijing had been tightening controls over the minerals and magnets that sit inside everything from factory robots to missile actuators. And it did so again in October by expanding rare earth export restrictions and adding new processing steps and technologies to its control list. China followed that rulemaking with licensing practices that multiple exporters described as slower and more demanding, reducing magnet shipments in September even before the formal expansion took effect. The numbers told the story with little ambiguity. China's rare earth exports fell 31% in September from August, while rare earth magnet volumes reversed a 3-month climb. Why this matters: export control frictions in one direction quickly translate into input shortage pressure in the other, because most global processing capacity for these materials remains concentrated in China. Strategic connector. Japan's list targeting sensitive end users intersects with China's licensing on critical inputs, creating a feedback loop that tightens with each incremental step. Factory floors felt it first. In Shizuoka, Suzuki Motor halted production of its Swift model for 2 weeks in late May and mid-June, with sources citing shortages linked to China's export curbs on rare earth products. Output resumed only after parts began to flow. In the same window, China's shipments of rare earth magnets halved month over month in May and were down nearly 3/4 year over year, the sharpest drop since at least 2012, forcing automakers and electronics suppliers to triage inventories. That contraction, followed by a summer rebound as some licenses were granted, signaled how a licensing pen stroke could whipsaw entire production schedules in Aichi and Kyushu as much as in Detroit or Stuttgart. Tokyo's calculus was complicated by politics at home and abroad. After a turbulent summer that ended with Shigeru Ishiba's resignation, Parliament voted Sanae Takaichi in as Japan's first female prime minister on October 21st, and her government immediately framed an industrial push built around semiconductors, artificial intelligence, aerospace, shipbuilding, and defense. Finance Minister Katsunobu Kato amplified the security of supply message days later, calling out the risk posed by China's latest rare earth curbs and urging coordination among G7 partners. By late October, Tokyo paired that domestic stance with external hedging. Japan and the United States signed a framework on next-generation nuclear power and rare earths, presenting it as a way to reduce reliance on a single processor for materials essential to vehicles, electronics, and defense systems. That diplomatic move did not erase the immediate arithmetic. China still produces the overwhelming majority of refined rare earths and magnet alloys. Even optimistic industry estimates leave most of the world's magnet metal supply chain to Chinese refiners. On the commerce desks of Sogo Shosha, procurement teams were forced to map the ground as it shifted beneath their feet. Sojitz announced it had begun importing heavy rare earths from Australia's Lynas, ore mined in Australia, separated and refined in Malaysia, explicitly as a non-China stream for high-end applications. Yet the same team still filed paperwork to Chinese counterparts because specific dysprosium-bearing inputs or magnet grades continued to be available only with Chinese processing or licensing. That dual track mirrored a wider market reality. When Beijing tightened approvals again in October, shipments sagged despite earlier summer licenses, and firms once more worked their contact books to keep lines running. Why this matters? Diversified supply cannot substitute for specialized chemistry overnight. The bottleneck often lives in processing steps, not ore. Strategic connector hedging via Australia or the United States buys time, but high coercion nodes, magnet alloys, and heavy rare earth separation still tie back to China's ecosystem. The chip story, really sits on top of the magnet story. When Japan broadened its end-user controls in September, officials described the list as a tool to prevent sensitive goods from ending up in weapons programs. But Beijing read it as an escalation that, in their view, unjustly ensnared Chinese firms, and they said so publicly. Industry readouts captured the second-order effect. Japanese toolmakers and part suppliers already faced guardrails on service and spares for Chinese fabs. Further tightening risked losing maintenance windows or upgrade slots, which could potentially affect order books in the next fiscal year. Tokyo Electron's cautious outlook, delivered just 5 days ago, traced a line between export restrictions and weaker profit guidance, even as the company highlighted AI-driven demand elsewhere. On the Chinese side of the ledger, the tool that really mattered in 2025 was rare earth licensing. The Ministry of Commerce pushed a stricter regime this spring. Exports of magnets dropped to pandemic-era lows in May. Partial détente with Washington restored some flow by midsummer. Then a new October expansion retightened the valve. Analysts warned that the latest rules extended to foreign producers using Chinese material or equipment, widening Beijing's reach across the supply chain. That reach, by the way, matters in Nagoya's EV corridors just as much as in Kanazawa's machine tool shops. Consultancy tallies cited by Reuters put China's share at roughly 70% of mining, 85% of refining, and about 90% of magnet and alloy production, a span that crosses from the mine mouth to the motor. CRU's analysis, also reported by Reuters, estimates China supplies around 90% of the world's rare earth magnets outright. The implication for Toyota's e-axle suppliers or Denso's motor lines is pretty straightforward. Dysprosium and terbium content determines magnet performance at high temperatures, and licensing delays turn into overtime schedules, redesigns, or simply fewer finished cars. Tokyo's policy community sees the trap and is, trying to widen exits. JOGMEC continues to underwrite upstream bets and offtake arrangements. MITI curates a web of bilateral critical minerals MOUs, and the government encourages scrap recovery and magnet recycling to shave primary demand. Those institutional steps are traceable across official releases and program documents this year. But parallel moves by partners can narrow options. In June, India sought to halt rare earth exports to Japan from its state miner to conserve domestic supply, pinching one of the non-Chinese streams Japanese buyers had nurtured. Why this matters? Alternate suppliers are not always independent. Several feedstocks still rely on Chinese separation or tolling before arriving as usable oxides or alloys. Strategic connector. As long as critical steps sit on Chinese soil, non-Chinese ore cannot fully immunize Japanese industry from Chinese licensing. Across the Sea of Japan, Beijing understands leverage when it sees it. Reuters chronicled how magnet shipments rose through August after some exporters gained licenses, then slipped in September as approvals hardened again, a tempo that coincided with big-ticket diplomatic calendars. When a United States-China understanding on general licenses surfaced in Washington press guidance late last week, Brussels immediately said it was negotiating for similar treatment. Evidence that even large blocs must bargain for throughput. Back in Tokyo, the semiconductor security narrative still drives headlines. According to the September Reuters dispatch, Beijing asked Japan to reverse its pattern of adding Chinese companies to the end-user list, even as Tokyo's public line stressed non-discrimination and WMD-related risk criteria. Financial Times coverage earlier this year captured Japanese industry anxiety over Chinese controls on chip materials, a precursor to the autumn's push and pull. Those concerns echo on earnings calls. Tool makers and materials firms warn of compliance drag, while car makers and robotics suppliers track magnet inventories with the urgency normally reserved for semiconductors in 2021. The car sector's exposure is no abstraction. The Suzuki stoppage was brief, but it revealed how a small motor component can idle an entire line. Reuters commodity columns flagged the broader risk succinctly in April. China has a vice-like grip on rare earth magnets, and the magnets themselves are on the control list. When September data showed shipments easing again, the EIU's read was that Beijing understands the strategic value of timing, and that counterparties will notice. Why this matters. Japanese export controls intended to protect national security can coexist with, but not cancel, a physical dependence on Chinese origin inputs that underpin the same industrial base. Strategic connector policy moves that restrict what leaves. Tokyo must be weighed against market realities that restrict what enters it. Inside ministries, the response mixes long-term bets with short-term triage. The new United States-Japan framework signals capital for non-Chinese streams. Sojitsu's Linus cargoes signal supply optionality at the margin. Licensing diplomacy with Beijing signals recognition that some flows must continue. On the ground, exporters in China reported it had grown increasingly difficult to obtain new licenses in September. The following month's rule expansion formalized that tightness. Bloomberg and Reuters both chronicled Tokyo Electron's balancing act this autumn: demand for AI-era wafers on one side, export control drag on service and tools to China on the other. Financial Times' earlier reporting traced how Tokyo calculated risk as Beijing signaled curbs on chip materials. The MITI list update in September shows how that calculation is now a standing policy tempo, with periodic list expansions and occasional removals. The numbers behind the politics keep forcing the same question. China produces more than 90% of processed rare earths and rare earth magnets, according to data cited across multiple Reuters analyses this autumn. That central fact explains why European officials are still negotiating for general licenses, like those Washington says it secured, and why Japanese buyers, even while inking deals with allies, still queue for Chinese paperwork. One figure in Tokyo summarized the mood with policy rather than prose. On November 4th, Prime Minister Takaichi launched an economic strategy headquarters to channel public investment into semiconductors, defense, and other sectors exposed to input choke points, instructing ministers to build public-private roadmaps for each designated industry. A day earlier, analysts were still parsing her rise from contender to premier, and what it means for coordination with the Bank of Japan and for industrial subsidies that will decide how quickly domestic magnet and materials capacity can scale. A month of dispatches, tables, and factory stoppage notices now lands in one place. By expanding its end-user list, Japan signaled it is willing to bear commercial friction to defend export control norms. By tightening rare earth licensing, China reminded Tokyo that magnets, alloys, and heavy rare earth chemistry remain deeply centered in Chinese plants. If you are counting units instead of headlines, Sojitsu's new shipments from Linus register as a hedge. If you are counting hours, Suzuki's May shutdown registers as a warning about how quickly an input pinch can ripple through output. A final unresolved beat sits at the junction of policy and physics. The United States and Japan signed their framework and will push funds toward non-Chinese streams. Europe is asking Beijing for general licenses. Tokyo Electron is threading compliance needles, and Beijing's licensing officers can still accelerate or slow approvals that determine whether dysprosium flows into a traction motor in Tahara next week. Japan can and will buy more from allies, but when a precision motor needs a high coercivity magnet with specific Chinese processed inputs and a license stamped in Beijing, the order book answers a simpler question than Geopolitics, whose signature releases the cargo today. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.